Chapter 15. For the last 2 weeks, the sea had been perfect in terms of sailing conditions. Too perfect. It was a little worrisome to Arturo and Hernan, since they had to work a lot harder to keep the men busy. Originally, the brothers' plan was to keep the crews busy with taking care of the ship's provisions and general care so they wouldn't have time to start questioning the unorthodox manner in which they were sailing. Although none of the men had any expertise with navigation, they were sailors with years of experience. So it was inevitable someone would figure out the real destination of the 2 ships. They had no idea an imbecile would be the first to figure it out. Each ship had a crew of 12 men. On Arturo's ship, though, trouble began brewing. Horace. Malcolm looked at his partner in crime, expectantly hoping he would rouse without any of the other crew being alerted. The pervasive snores coming from the rest of the bunks down here in the belly of the ship told him he was safe for now. Flick! Malcolm quietly bellowed again. No, sweetie, I don't have to leave for another hour, said Horace in his sleep. Just lay back down here. Malcolm rolled up an old shirt and tossed it to his friend from a distance, making sure it hit him in the face. Malcolm had enough experience with Horace to know if you were going to wake him up from a dead sleep, then you better give him a wide berth until he knows what's going on. Sure enough, getting hit in the face with a shirt caused Horace to silently yet decisively bolt up from his prone position into one ready for battle. In his right hand was a rather large and menacing knife he always kept under his pillow. As he slept, Horace always kept his hand on the knife, so he was able to slit the neck of any hapless idiot who wandered too close. It was one reason why he had the nickname Flick. His weapon of choice was this articulating knife he could wield with deadly accuracy, and often did. "Put that thing away, you idiot!" admonished Malcolm, who was only slightly more intelligent. Relaxing his stance, Flick retracted his knife and sat back down on his bedroll. "Now what'd you go and wake me up for, Malcolm? I was just about to have me way with Bunny." Normally Malcolm wouldn't have taken his life into his hands like this, but something had been bothering him for the last several nights, keeping him up. He had been spending part of the night watching the sky from a gun port near the forecastle where their bunks were. He started noticing a pattern to the way the stars appeared after all the men went to sleep. He knew that during the night the captains were manning the rudder while the crew slept. That in itself was strange. But then, each night, Malcolm saw the stars which came up in front of the ship swing to port, and stay there for the rest of the night. On the few occasions he awakened before sunup, he saw the stars move back from port to take their place off the bow. Plus, the way the captains ordered only one sail on the mizzen to be set, it just wasn't adding up. "Something's not right. I've been watching the sky through the gun port. The captain is doing something strange, but I can't figure it out."
"What is he doing that is strange?"
said a rather deep, substantial voice from the shadows. Malcolm and Flick instantly reacted, and once again the knives were at the ready, until they realized it was only Samson who asked the question. Samson was a large and imposing man who said he came from some islands, but it was never clear which islands they might have been. He was one of the few individuals Malcolm and Horace actually trusted, misplaced though it was. Malcolm and Flick sat back down on the edge of their bunks as they stowed their respective knives, and rested their elbows on their knees. Speaking softly, Malcolm was the first to answer. "It's the stars. I'm telling you something's not right." Malcolm pointed out the gun port near the bunkheads. "When I goes to bed, I see the stars. But if I wait long enough, I sees them swing over that-a-way." He gestured to the port side of the ship. "Then," he continued, Just before sunup, I sees them swing back to the front of the ship. Something's not right, I'm telling you. Samson looked at Malcolm and thought for a moment. After a few seconds he leaned back against a supporting timber near his bunk, reached up, and twisted what amounted to a large and thick toothpick he always kept hanging out of his mouth. When he wasn't eating anything, that is. Through eyes squeezed into slits, he regarded the two before him, thinking they must be two of the stupidest men he had ever seen. Early on, it was obvious to him these two were not real sailors, but were criminals with their own agenda, although he didn't know what it was. Samson had his own plans for the trip, though, so he decided to wait and see what they would do first. That was why he was awake to hear Malcolm and Horace. He decided early on that a potential enemy in front of Open Eyes was much better than behind one's back. After about a minute, with the two imbeciles looking on, Samson started smiling. He had figured out the real reason why the ships were at sea. He had been sailing for the majority of his life, but he was intelligent enough to fake being new to the sea to the captains. That hidden intelligence caused Samson to put two and two together and see that if the stars were swinging to port, then the southerly course they were taking during the day was being changed at night to a course due west. Considering the captains were only using one sail during the day, but full sails at night, Samson figured all the sailing during the day was only a ruse to keep the crew pacified. He figured they were not only sailing west at night, but in fact were probably sailing northwest, since they were probably canceling out the slow southerly progress they made during the day. It wasn't much of a bother to Samson that they were sailing west. His ancestors had been living on the sea for many generations, and from them he learned how his people had come from a land a very long distance away to the west. His ancestors weren't subscribers to the whole flat earth thinking of the day. If Arturo and Hernan had realized Samson was a pirate quite well known to the mariners of England, they certainly wouldn't have hired him. He was waiting for the ship to acquire its booty, and when it did, he would appropriate it and eliminate most, if not all, on board who weren't with him. On this particular voyage, he wanted to see what kind of business he could scare up in these waters. Sure enough, he landed on something here very interesting. Legends of lands to the west laden with gold. He definitely liked the idea of getting his hands on some of it. Meanwhile, he had to figure out what to do with these dimwits. They could be a liability, but then again, they might be able to help him keep his eyes on more than just he alone could. Figuring they would be easy enough to manipulate, he decided to gamble that they were indeed the simpletons he suspected.
"I know exactly what is happening,"
said Samson with an accent neither Malcolm or Horace had ever heard.
"Our captains are very shrewd ones. They are aware of the way the stars move in these waters, and they are making sure we are still going south, even though the stars try to trick them."
"The stars move?" said a very unsure Horace.
"Of course they do, my friend,"
said Samson with a large smile on his face. Then, deciding to shame them into submission, he said,
"You aren't some of those stupid sailors who don't believe the stars move at night, are you?"
"Oh, no," said Malcolm. "Don't be tippy. Of course we aren't. Isn't that right, Flick?" Yeah, of course we are. Or aren't. Right," said a confused Horace, nodding his meaty head, his jowls undulating back and forth. Samson smiled at the success of his ruse.
"No, I should have known better. I didn't think you would be so stupid."
Leaning forward, he came close to the two men and said,
"I don't think the rest of these dogs here are as smart as you two, though. They wouldn't understand just how much our captains know about navigation. We should keep this to ourselves. What do you think?
Malcolm looked over at Horace, who was looking at him bewilderedly, then back at Samson. "No," he said. "I was thinking the same thing."
"I knew you were the smart ones here,"
said Samson, all the while knowing when the time came, these two would be the last of the crew he would kill, since they would initially be useful to do the messy work. For now, though, he would just have to wait and see what happened. Meanwhile, on deck, in the light of a full moon, Arturo was signaling to his brothers with the flags. As each letter was signaled, he would spell it out on paper. Provisions at 60%. Concerned about crew figuring out courses. Should talk about when we might decide turn around. Hernan was thinking about it too. He wasn't willing to put the crew in danger of starvation. He decided to signal back to his brother. Agree. Should consider in 2 days. Looking toward his brother's ship, Arturo saw the reply. Agreed. There it was. They were nearing the end of their ability to go on. While finding a faster way to the Indies was the goal, they didn't want to put the men at risk of starvation before getting back to their port of call. No, they would just have to sail back home, secure a set of bigger boats that could handle a larger load of supplies, and try again with more provisions. Samson had other ideas, though. He took into account the amount of provisions still on board in relation to the amount of provisions already consumed, and he could see they were nearing the halfway point. He also figured out the captains didn't actually know where, or if, they would fall upon land. If they did, they wouldn't have invented this elaborate scheme of sailing south during the day and west at night. Once the captains determined they were nearing the point of no return, they would invent a reason to turn around, then hightail it back to Spain. Armed with these realizations, Samson started concocting a scheme to sail the rest of the way to the lands of his ancestors. As Arturo contemplated the impending failure of the voyage, he looked toward the rising sun and then to the cloudless sky, thinking to himself, "Wow, the weather here is beautiful." He didn't know this was going to be one of the last peaceful days of his life. Sure enough, as agreed, 2 days later, Arturo called for all hands on deck. On this particular day, he hadn't bothered to steer the ship back towards the south, so it was still full sail to the west. Hernan was having the same meeting with his crew on his own ship. Speaking with as commanding a voice as possible, Arturo began.
"Men, as you know, we've been sailing for about a month now, and we've been waiting for our sister ship to bring us the shipment of goods and riches that come from the Indies. Since we have not been contacted by them yet, my brother and I believe they have succumbed to the treacherous weather while sailing around the southern tip of Africa."
A rather loud and booming voice came from the back of the group.
"There's something else you aren't telling us, isn't there, Captain?"
Samson saw that now was the time to put his plan in motion. He said in a voice dripping with contempt,
"Why don't you tell the men the real reason we are out here, Captain?"
"I don't know what you're talking about," was Arturo's only reply.
"Oh? What about the fact we've been sailing west every night under full sail? The same direction we're sailing in now. Men, this man brought us out here as a sacrifice to Poseidon himself. They want gold, and they are willing to make a bargain with the devil to get it."
"What? That's nonsense. I haven't heard of any golden... Arturo realized he had just let the proverbial cat out of the bag. Who was this cretin? How had he hoodwinked Arturo so easily into giving up the real nature of the voyage?
Ah, so now the real truth comes out.
Turning to the crew, he said,
This man has been leading us west to our own deaths. In fact, my friend here,
Samson gestured to Horace, smiling a rather toothy smile with what teeth he still had left,
just told me he overheard Captain Arturo and his brother talking among themselves about how they wanted to die by falling off the edge of the world, and they didn't care if they had to take us with them. In fact, why else would we be sailing west now?
Instantly there was a loud uproar among the crew. Now was Malcolm's turn to speak up from another side of the ship. "Kill him, and turn the ship around." The crowd had been whipped up into a mob, and started feeding off of itself. While Samson and his two henchmen looked on, 8 pairs of hands grabbed hold of Arturo and hauled him to the fife rail near the foremast and tied him there. Samson made sure a gun magically appeared in the crowd, and it was now being wielded by one of the nastier and unprincipled of the mob. Hurling taunts at Arturo, this sailor slowly drew his arm up to shoot Arturo in the head. At that moment, what sounded like the bellow of a cannon pierced the air. The figurehead of this ship all but exploded as if it had been packed solid with black powder. Within the span of a single second, whatever made the figurehead disintegrate caused the rest of the ship to be blown to pieces. Arturo was the first to die, from a massive timber hitting him across the back of his head, severing his spine, and instantly taking his life. The rest of the crew weren't so lucky, though. As they witnessed the destruction of the ship by an unknown force, they all scrambled to the stern. Eventually, the advancing destruction threatened to consume them as they stood against the rail on the deck, above the captain's quarters. One and all dove from the ship into the ocean, then swam like mad from the unseen specter of demolition. Hernan wasn't faring any better. His crew was quite angry and had already tied Hernan's hands when they heard the other ship explode. They all watched aghast as Arturo's ship was swallowed up by the sea. As it turns out, someone on Hernan's ship had figured out the westerly course too, which only added fuel to the mob on his ship. While his crew hadn't been incited to kill Hernan, they did mutiny, and ended up locking him in the brig. Hernan pleaded every hour of every day for a week to go back and rescue his brother and the rest of the crew. It fell on deaf ears. Nobody was willing to go back and suffer the same fate as the other ship. Once a week had passed, there was no point believing Arturo might have survived. Perhaps it would have helped knowing he was probably the only one on his ship granted an instant and painless death. All the others had succumbed to a school of great whites, which happened to be in the right place at the right time. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.